Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the People Overview and Scrutiny meeting on Tuesday, the 15th of October. It's now gone 7 p.m, and I would like to start this meeting. I would like to remind everyone present that this meeting is being live streamed and recorded for publication on the Council's website. So we shall move on to items of business. Item 1 is apologies. We have received apologies from councillors Aliki, Cecil, Panjala, Day and Massey, from our co-optee Georgina Bonsu, and from Les Billingham. So are there any further apologies? Got all those? Sorry? Okay, I'm going deaf. Sorry, I do. Janet Simon, I do apologise. This glass screen gets in the way. I do apologise. Right, so that's the apologies to be given. We then move on to item 2, which is the minutes. Does anyone have any comments on the accuracy of the minutes, which hopefully you've all had a look at?
I don't think my apologies were given for the last meeting, so just to make sure that's recorded in the minutes, thanks.
Absolutely, and as you may remember on the evening, it was my fault, a miscommunication, so I apologise retrospectively that you were omitted, but your apologies were received, so I'm sure that will be noted again. If that's okay, I'll be happy to approve the minutes. Would someone who was present like to second that? Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Johnson. So we take it that the minutes are approved. We then move on to items of urgent business, and I have a few things to bring to members' attention this evening. Firstly, it is my sad duty to report that in the early hours of this morning, former Borough Mayor and an ex-councillor, Margaret Jones JP, passed away. Her name is behind me, the first one on the board. It is particularly important to raise Margaret's passing at this meeting, as she was an iconic representative of the reason why this committee is in place. She was someone who was passionate about scrutiny of the health and well-being care offered to residents in this borough. I was privileged some years ago to serve alongside Margaret and her late husband Merlin on the Board of Governors of Basildon Hospital. She was fastidious in holding the hospital management to account, and in her determination and forthright way made sure that her views and those of the people of Thurrock were recognised by the hospital management. Margaret was one of a kind, a force of nature who surpassed political boundaries and won the respect of all who knew her. It sums up that respect that she won over and above party loyalty, that another former mayor, Sue Little, who did so much for Margaret in her later years, was by her bedside caring for her this morning when she passed. Margaret will be much missed. I'm not going to ask members to rise for a minute's silence in respect. I'm sure that and other tributes will happen at full council, and Margaret would have much preferred we got on with matters in hand. The second item I bring to members is also of a sad nature, though thankfully the subject of it is simply moving on to other things. Last week saw the Director of Adult Social Services, Ian Wake, moving on from Thurrock Council, which he has served immeasurably well for more than 9 years. Aside from Ian's immense contribution to his directorate, he stepped in to take the role of acting chief executive as the council crumbled under its self-inflicted financial catastrophe, and he won huge cross-party respect in helping steady a sinking ship. The gain to the people of Norfolk and its county council as he moves to take on a directorship there is very much Thurrock's loss. On a personal level, I regard Ian as a friend, not just as an officer. He was someone I could turn to for advice, and sometimes he was forthright in his advice, but it was always on the money. And I wish him, and I'm sure do members here this evening and officers, every success and the very best of health in his new role. And it would be inopportune if I did not welcome Robert Percy to the interim role as Head of Service. So good evening, Robert, thank you. I would also, though he's not able to be with us this evening, to welcome Councillor David Day as Vice Chair of this committee and to thank him for stepping in for me at short notice at a meeting yesterday. I am sure members of this committee will be aware of the recent BBC News report that flagged up that Thurrock is now the worst place in the country in terms of the number of patients each GP is serving. The statistics are shocking and will be, I'm sure, of immense concern and interest to this committee. I am aware that the health portfolio holder, Councillor Mark Hooper, is already on the case and pressing for answers, but I have also requested that the CEO or an appropriate director from the Mid and South Essex Integrated Care Board is invited to our next committee meeting on the 19th of November. They will, I am sure, be ready to answer your questions on how the GP shortages in Thurrock have happened and what plans the ICB has in place to address this matter urgently. And I would invite, if you've got any comment to make, Councillor Hooper, on this subject, if you'd like to speak.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I emailed Tom Abel on this news and Mike Thorne, who is the chair of the ICB. They did get back to me in the sense that they are disappointed, obviously, that we are short of so many GPs in Thurrock, which I think should be about 21, 22 GPs. But some of the actions they've taken is obviously we had 5 GPs that we recruited through the kind of fellowship workshops that were planned as part of the integrated medical wellbeing centres. They are spread across the borough. And there are now 22 education GP practices within the borough. The hope will be that as people train here, they'll want to stay here. Nevertheless, I have asked for a meeting with Tom Abel and Mike Thorne, which Rob will organise for us in November. I've also written to the Secretary of State with my concerns around the lack of GPs in Thurrock.
Thank you, Councillor Hooper. And it's not an urgent matter per se, but I know that our Childhood Obesity Task and Finish Group is making progress. Thank you for your work as Chair, Councillor Rigby, so far, and I just wondered if you would like the opportunity to just give a brief update to members, how it's going.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I can give a brief update. So it's underway now. We've had a few meetings and we've got a few more scheduled. So we've met with maternity and health visiting so far. And this week we're meeting with stakeholders to include primary care and schools. And then we've got meetings with youth group and finally with the family hubs. Outside of that as well, I've sort of done a bit of investigating into different diet trends, and I've got an appointment to go to visit Perfect Pantry as well to see what they're doing as well. So, yeah, it's all underway. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Rigby. Excellent work, and I look forward to the outcome of that in due course. And finally, on sort of matters, again, it's not necessarily an urgent matter, but time always presses on these things. And one of our co-opted members, Nicola Cranch, who is a representative, your period of office ends at the end of this year, not the civic year, the actual year. And I hope that you would want to continue because the work that you've done is very much appreciated. And I've discussed with our Democratic Services team, and we will be talking to you about how hopefully you can progress. And hopefully also asking, because we need another member as well, it will be, you know, the more the merrier to come and join our little bunch. But I didn't want you to feel that it wasn't being noted and whatever. And I say thank you for, as I thank all co-opted members for their support and service, and we will get onto that. So thank you for all that. That's that one out the way. Back to the agenda, declarations of interest. Has anyone got any declarations of interest to make? Excellent. Good. Right, we move on to the first of our reports this evening, which is on special education needs provision, and at which point I will turn over the chair to Michelle. Lucas.
Thank you very much, colleagues, and thank you, Chair. We were asked to provide a report on some of the key issues currently facing special educational needs in Thurrock. And I think what's really interesting, colleagues, this isn't just what Thurrock are facing. Many of the things that we talk about in this report are national issues. So the incredibly large increase in requests for education healthcare plans to support our children, The lack of special school places, that's a recurrent one, and I think I heard on the news last week that this is something that the government are really looking at, because actually it's a huge issue right across the country. I think the other thing for us is, of course, there is a national shortage around educational psychologists, and you need a report from an educational psychologist to issue your education healthcare plan. So you can see there's real challenges in meeting timescales. The timescales for issuing a plan, once we agree to assess and move towards plan, is 20 weeks. You will see in the report we're around 52% at the moment. That is lower than we were last year, but in the main, many of the reasons for that is outlined in the report around the lack of educational psychologists. I think the other thing within this is, of course, we have a local area SEND inspection. So a bit like the ILACs, Special Educational Needs, also has an Ofsted inspection. And actually, Thurrock took part in a thematic review around May time this year, looking at the preparing for adulthood. So they came and looked at what we were doing locally around preparing our young people for adulthood. And that will form part of a national report. We're expecting that actually any day. So we should get some sort of key learning in relation to that. I think the other thing to mention to committee, of course, is the designated schools grant. And that's in a number of blocks. And the one we're interested in tonight, of course, is high needs. I think Thurrock has, over the years, done really well in this area. We've brought down the overspend, and that's because we've worked really hard with our school communities to put in a number of resource spaces locally. What we do is look to keep our children local. We want children and young people part of their community. We want to keep them local. There will always be children that we have to move out of the authority because of the complexity of need. But actually the real drive is to keep our children local. And I think the other thing, and again, you'd have picked up some of the press around that, is the demand in home-to-school transport. And I think we've picked up some of that in the report. I don't intend to go through the report, colleagues. The chair very helpfully sent through a number of questions that I think that you wanted answered. So I'm hoping that we've got the responses to those. So, Chair, back to you and how you're going to manage the questions, please.
Yeah, I think four-armed is helpful, and I'm very, very grateful to the work of colleagues who have asked some really insightful questions, of which I've got copies here, but unfortunately, because I'm a bear with very little brain, I haven't actually put who the questions are going to be asked by. So if members have got questions, we will get through them all. So who would like to go first? I know, Councillor, you've definitely got a few questions. Yeah.
Do you want me to go through them all from this agenda item? So the first one relates to the EPs. So I'm aware that funding begins once an EHCP is issued. Are there any contingency plans to provide early funding for education providers to support pupils whose EHC needs assessment will go well over the 20 weeks due to the shortage of EPs?
Thank you. If I could take the question. So in terms of the additional funding, yes, we do have arrangements for precisely that reason, but also for other reasons where we have children who might move into the borough, for instance, at short notice, and we have interim funding arrangements. So there's always the opportunity for schools to put in a request for that interim. It hasn't been a huge issue in terms of the educational health needs assessments in terms of the timescales, but we have had regular requests for interim funding, and we're providing that. It might also be worth mentioning that we're also providing a higher level of funding to schools as a result of the complexity of need, because there's an unprecedentedly high level of need being currently supported in mainstream primaries in particular. And so we've been doing additional visits to schools, working with the schools around the types of support arrangements in place, and making further funding adjustments around that. But certainly in terms of the timing, there's arrangements in place.
Okay, thank you. And what's been communicated to education providers about the shortage of EPs and the potential for the late assessments, and what has their response been?
So in terms of the actual communication, I've been to both TAS and TIFA, both the secondary heads and primary heads association, discuss the situation with them, have very open conversations about how we're making sure we've got the best use of the educational psychology service at the moment. Yeah. So we've brought in new arrangements about consultation approaches, different ways of delivering advice and support for schools, and also looked at the sort of reporting arrangements to ensure that we're doing those as efficiently and effectively as possible. For instance, if we have a request in from a school or from a parent where there is a private report, we'll have one of our educational psychologists read that. If we feel it's an adequate cover, we'll add a cover note to that. If there's been a report in the last year from one of our psychologists, we'll do a follow-up report, but we'll have a conversation with the parents and with the school, and we'll do an addendum to that report. So we're taking a number of steps to do that. And generally speaking, schools have been very supportive, very understanding of the situation. They know the national situation. I sit on the national DFE board around it. And there is that, it is a situation that's facing virtually every education psychology service in the country.
And I'm just aware that, you know, if you...
Can I say, sorry, I was going to say, when you ask your question, would you mind just switching the thing of it? It helps with the recording of it. And the other thing, if you don't mind me, and this is to officers as well, and I'm very grateful, we're here to be accountable to the public. We know what some of the acronyms that we generally talk about mean. I can remember sitting quite often in council meetings in my other role, and people are speaking gobbledygook because I haven't got a clue what all these acronyms stand for. So if the first time we mention an acronym, it'd be really helpful for those outside this chamber to understand what they mean. Thanks. Sorry, over to you. Apologies, Councillor.
Yeah, I'm just aware that when, you know, if you've got a late EHC needs assessment, it can... parents can go to tribunal and make complaints. So, yeah, that was the reason for the question. The other question that I've got is about children with education, health and care plans, and how many pupils you've got that are educated otherwise than at school or electively home educated.
So, yes, I can give you those figures. So, in terms of those who are electively home educated, we've currently got 22 pupils on our systems where we've got pupils who are electively home education and education and health care plans. And it's worth mentioning that the annual reviews are supported by the local authority. Our school attendance support service would support those just as they do for all other pupils who are electively home educated to ensure there's an appropriate education offer in place. And in terms of education otherwise than at school, which again, just for the sake of clarity, is the category that we use where the local authority is in agreement with the parent, that is the appropriate type of education provision for that child. So it's a decision that's been jointly taken as part of the education and healthcare plan. And we've got 12 pupils who are currently educated as what we term EOTAS. And those reviews are supported by the SEND teams. The annual reviews are carried out by the local authority in those cases. Thank you.
Thank you. My next questions relate to 6.12. What does the professional development in point 1 look like? And will this have been completed by all schools in April? By April, sorry.
Yes, so we've looked at this and it depends on the individual schools. So we've asked schools to identify their individual needs. Some of the schools are grouping together to identify what their needs are going to be and do some joint training. So it will depend on how they themselves identify those training needs. The money will be spent by July because that's where, as part of the DFE programme, we're having 3 monthly monitoring performance data coming in with that, and the first one of that is actually due in December to identify where we are in terms of that training plan. But it will vary. I think autism is a common theme that's coming across, as I mentioned earlier, because of the high number of placements. So that's likely to be one of the highest needs. In secondary, to a certain extent, it will be social, emotional, mental health needs. But again, autism probably overrides that for most of those pupils. And of course, within the secondary school, the biggest impact we're seeing is children who are experiencing difficulties along the lines of anxiety. Some of those will be within the autistic spectrum, and that's obviously having a major impact on what we refer to as emotionally based school non-attendance. Thank you.
And how many alternative provisions do we commission, and how many children with the HCPs access alternative provision?
So the numbers, the alternative provisions we refer to are Olive alternative provision, which is our secondary number. Now, there are 68 pupils currently, or at the time which I wrote this, that's slightly higher from talking to them today. There are 68 pupils in Olive. Out of those, 9 of those have educational healthcare plans. And in our primary inclusion bases, which are the 2 inclusion bases which are supported for us by Osborne Trusts, the Thameside Primary School and East Tilbury Primary School, there are 14 pupils altogether there. And as things stand at the moment, 6 of those pupils have education and healthcare plans. So they're not designed specifically for the pupils with education and health plans, as opposed to the mainstream resource bases, which are at Dilks and at Quarry Hill, which are different type because those are designed for long-term support, but these are very much the turnaround process in those plans. But some of those children, almost by definition, will have plans because they've gone through that assessment process as well.
Thank you. And the last one for this agenda item, sorry, there's so many. How many pupils do we have in independent, non-maintained specialist schools? And has there been a reduction in the number of pupils attending these schools since the work started?
So there is ongoing demand, as Michelle mentioned earlier, in terms of a small number. We are a small user of independent non-maintained, but they tend to be higher cost, and that sometimes I think requires a bit of explanation there. So because we're using fewer, we're trying to keep as many pupils locally as possible. The ones we do seek tend to be for pupils with higher and more complex needs, and therefore they're more expensive. In 23 to 24, we had 41 pupils in INMS, or independent non-maintained specialist school day school, and we had 18 in residential INMS schools. And in 24-25, we currently have in day schools 38 pupils, and in residential schools we have 14 INMS schools. So that would indicate a slight reduction. I would be misleading if I was to infer that that is necessarily showing a pattern of decline. That may just be a seasonal performance position because of where we are at the moment in terms of that change, because we obviously are seeking placements, and part of the issue we talked about with the report is it reflects a shortage of placements as much as it does actually our demand for placements. So I just want to be clear about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And other members with questions? Yeah. Councillor Fish.
Thanks, Chair. My question was about the mainstream resource bases, which are mentioned on page 16 of the agenda. Just what kind of work goes on there, and who are the staff there?
Thank you. So the mainstream resource bases, as I said, the numbers of the mainstream resource bases are within the report. If I just run through them, would that be helpful in terms of the numbers? So we have 2 nursery mainstream resource bases. One of those is set up with a particular focus on speech and language needs. So it's run by the ICANN, or it is in the support of the ICANN organisation when we initially established that. So that's a highly intensive support arrangement for children in the early years with speech and language difficulties, support them going to mainstream school. We also have, that's for 3 nominal places, and our second nursery place, sorry, is at Stanford Hope, which is our designated nursery. Now that's a very broad, I suppose, category of need, very specifically because we may have a range of needs, and we wanted to have a nursery where there was an opportunity for parents to access additional support rather than those who access that support obviously in their mainstream nursery. Most children, of course, with additional needs would go to their mainstream nursery in the first instance, would get support there. But there's a small number who have said actually we'd like a designated nursery for a range of reasons. So those children at designated nursery, they might have quite a range from physical needs to hearing impairment or to other complex learning needs as well. So that's the 3 nursery full-time places there. In terms of our primary schools, we have a number of bases that, as you won't be surprised, that we've been developing around autism. If I start off, if I just run through them, we have 10 places at Lansdowne Primary School. That's a long-established base. Initially, we started that with children with learning difficulties. We extended it to children with speech, language, communication needs, and many of those children are identified as having autism. We have 5 primary places at the Stanford La Hope Visual Impaired Unit, the VI unit. Again, it's a long-established base. We have 20 places for children with speech and language needs. That's separate from autism, and that we have very high involvement for our speech and language services there. In fact, we have some speech and language therapy staff, the community staff, who are based within that Corringham base. That's 20 pupil places there. We have 10 places at Dilks Primary School, and that's for children with social, emotional, and mental health, and another 10 places at Quarry Hill Primary School, again for social, emotional, and mental health, and those are both run by the Catalyst Trust. We link those bases very closely together for obvious reasons. At Warren Primary School, we have 18 places currently for children with hearing impairment, and for deaf children, there's a range of needs there. Many of those children, though, in Warren have quite complex needs, have a range of other needs in addition to their hearing impairments, their deafness. In fact, we have, again, a number of children who are identified as being part of the autistic continuum as well there. We have a relatively new base at Aveley Primary School for autism, with 10 places there, further 10 places at East Tilbury as part of our inclusion base, and 6 places at Thameside as an inclusion base. I should make clear that the 2 bases we refer to as inclusion bases are in fact for pupils who may be at risk of of permanent exclusion or experiencing social, emotional, mental health needs in schools. They don't necessarily have to have educational health care plans. It's to support those schools, support those children, often with a time-out placement, supporting those children, then returning them back to their mainstream school. So they're slightly different in terms of the organisation of the bases. And then we have 2 further bases for children with autism, 10 pupils at Dean Home. Again, that was a relatively new development with the Swessit Trust. And we have coming up, we have 10 pupils who will be at the Arthur Bugler Primary School, which will be, obviously that's run by the Osborne Trust. So we've been developing in the past 2 years in particular, more places around mainstream primary, because that's been our biggest demand for children with autism, and that's why we've been developing those bases. They all have different approaches. Some have more of an applied behavioural analysis, verbal behaviour approach, using staff. In fact, we've got some ex-staff from Treetop supporting some of those bases. Other bases have a very different approach, a person-centred approach, using different activities such as teach-type approaches, which is a particular form of structured teaching. We're aware that parents have expressed a view. Some parents want Treetop's places and want that sort of approach. Other parents have expressed views very specifically. They want a different type of approach and support arrangements for their children. That's why we've got a range of different approaches in place. And the Arthur Bugler one, as it opens, will have a different range of approaches. They won't be using a specific behavioural approach. When we set up Lansdowne, we specifically did some other training with them, so there was a greater range of choice available there. At secondary school, we have 20 places at Chafford 100, which is for children with speech, language, communication needs, and what used to be referred to as high-functioning autism needs. By that, we mean they are children who will be able to access the mainstream curriculum. We've had some children who've done very well indeed through that process. In fact, one of our children who ended up going to Oxbridge came through that base because their social communication needs identified around the autistic spectrum went on to do that. So that's the 20 places there, though. The majority of those, again, have autism rather than just an identification of speech, language, communication needs. Then at St Clair's, we have 17 places for what we've termed sensory needs, because they have both the hearing impairment and the visual impairment bases there, and the numbers vary year on year. So we put it together as a total number, and we work with them in terms of the allocation of those places rather than specifying a specific number for either hearing impairment or for, I should refer to it as deaf, because they prefer the label deaf for that base. That was from the young children themselves, or obviously children who are visually impaired. So that's our 17 places at St Clair's. And finally, we have 30 places at Ormiston Park, which is for children with social, emotional, mental health needs. Some of those children have come up from our primary bases, particularly from Dilks or Quarry Hill bases have come up through. A few of them have come up through other inclusion bases as well. So that's the overall. In terms of staffing, all of those have to have trained staff, as in teaching staff involved with the bases in different ways. They deliver those services in different ways depending on the arrangements there. For the bases, just like any other special school, where you've got children who are either deaf or children who with visual impairment, we have to have a set ratio, quite rightly, for teachers with deaf or teachers with visual impaired. So they formally have staff associated, and we do a regular return, particularly to the National Deaf Children's Society, around the ratio of our staff, trained staff for those children. So that's a set ratio that we agree in terms of the sensory standards for those bases. The other bases, primarily, I think with the bases for children with autism, a lot of those support arrangements are one-to-one support programs for those individuals. They're highly individualised programs. Whether they're using applied behavioural analysis or not, they're using those sorts of approaches. So they tend to be one-to-one for a lot of those bases. Slightly different for the Lansdowne base, where we have more children coming into the primary classes. And within the other bases, particularly with Quarry Hill and with Dilks, with the social, emotional, mental health needs pupils, we use learning coaches alongside the teaching staff, and they support those children in the mainstream classes. Very much with all those bases, there's a focus and encouragement to access the mainstream curriculum, the mainstream classes where that's appropriate and suitable, so they haven't passed that mainstream inclusion. And that's obviously part of the philosophy of these bases as well. And we've got ongoing discussions around further mainstream resource bases, particularly for primary age children with autism. In the report I mentioned about a project with Tilbury Pioneer School, which will be part of a bigger building project there to provide further bases there. Though our greatest need is going to be, within a relatively short period of time, around secondary places for autism. We're starting discussions around that to look specifically around the resources and arrangements around that, because clearly we have a very significant population of children with highly complex needs. We're talking about children who are predominantly coming to school as in a pre-verbals, they're not using spoken language. Many of those toileting needs with very complex behavioural and learning needs coming up through our school system, and clearly we need to make sure we've got the appropriate arrangements. We've had huge expansion, as you know, at Treetop School and the Free School as well. We put an additional classroom on the Free School this September in order to pick up on those children coming up year 6 and 7, but given the scale of the challenge that we face around that, we're in discussion obviously with schools to look at their other alternatives, the best way of supporting those children in the sort of medium term as they come up through school. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, fire away if you got.
I'm interested that you said that there's different approaches to autism in the different resource bases, but are they all working towards the same outcome in terms of what you said about, for instance, accessing the national curriculum?
Yes, I mean, that's a very interesting point. The approaches are different in the sense that some of the bases, I should explain again, in terms of Treetops, for those who aren't familiar with Treetops and Treetops Free School, we have done a lot of work over the last sort of 10 to 15 years, providing individual highly specific programs of support for children with very complex needs with autism, and a lot of that is using techniques referred to as applied behavioural analysis, or ABA, verbal behaviour. Those terms mean different things in different contexts, I hasten to add. The verbal behaviour part of that describes an approach where the staff work for a significant period of time pairing up with those individual children, getting them to respond to them due to the reinforcement strategies they're using, and then using an individualized approach, which tends to be a very specific skills program, which is most focused, obviously, as you'd expect, on communication. So you might do a lot of activities with the children, initially getting them to copy actions yourself or to verbalise or to encourage a different activity. Then you do naming and pointing activities. So some of that is highly structured. There's a lot of informal play and natural environment learning as part of that. So that's the approach used in Treetops, and consequently, and in the Free School. Consequently, we use a lot of those procedures in some of the other bases. So if I think of the Dean Home base in particular in Stifford Clays, they have an ex-member of Treetop staff. They're using what would be quite a similar program to the sort of program in Treetops. In terms of the curriculum approach, it's based very much on the individual child's needs. So communication will be the first priority, but they would all have to show a link towards the national curriculum and the other curriculum opportunities they would have if they're in a mainstream school. And I know I've certainly spent time with HMI when they've been in Treetops as part of the Ofsted inspections, discussing that with themselves and explaining the different ways in which we have that link to the curriculum to make sure it's an appropriate curriculum for those children, but them getting the greatest breadth of curriculum at the same time so they're able to access those other activities. I think that's true for all the other bases as well, but they would deliver it in a slightly different way. So certainly Lansdowne use elements of what's referred to as a teach program. I just give a simple example of that. They would have a series of activities where they'd have different boxes, and it's really just a way of structuring those activities. It helps if they've got that order, so they use a lot of visual timetables. They have lists that they're working through. They might have visual representation in front of them, so they're doing a task. They know they're moving one task from an uncompleted to completed, and that sort of structure helps them work through at a pace on particular activities. But it would be linked to, obviously, the appropriate curriculum for that child, which would again be linked into the programs of study in terms of national curriculum and the national curriculum broader framework as well. And of course, for a lot of these children, they'll be working on the early years framework, given the types of skills. So there'll be a close link across into that. So that would be the approach both across the resource spaces, though delivered in different ways, in an individual way, and in the special schools. I hope that helps give an explanation. Thanks.
Any other questions? Yeah, Councillor Rigby.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick one. Are many parents, where they can afford to, looking for private educational psychologists to speed up the assessment?
Yes, there are occasions where parents certainly will look to to have a private psychologist assessment. Very often that's in the case where there's an appeal through a tribunal. It's more commonly where there's been an assessment of a child's needs carried out by the local authority. The local authority has drafted up the initial plan, sent it to the parents. We don't put the provision down at that point. The parent has specified a particular type of provision, and on occasions where the local authority views that would not be an appropriate provision for that child for a range of reasons, predominantly if it's an independent special school, it may be about availability of places and specifying that there would be a more appropriate within the cost effectiveness dimension of that to put forward an alternative suggestion. In those cases, or for some other reasons where a parent feels, they would then sometimes go for a private psychologist report in order to look into those issues and to put forward that case. We get fewer occasions where parents are seeking out that assessment, that private psychology assessment, purely to get that part of the assessment. Because once the assessment is approved, there is a duty on the local authority, obviously, to carry out that assessment. And although we said there are delays within that at the moment because of the staffing issues that within the report, we are getting through those reports, and therefore those reports will be completed, albeit there will be some delays within them. So there wouldn't be an immediate need from that point of view in order to do that. Prior to making that assessment, yes, very occasionally we do. Parents who feel very strongly that a child needs an assessment, and they discuss that with the school, and the school maybe express the view that they don't feel that's appropriate at that particular point in time. On some occasions, parents might contact a private psychologist to make that assessment. That's relatively rare, I'd say. Again, it's more really about whether there's a discussion or an appeal around provision. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Yeah, Councillor Hurrell.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I've got a few questions, if that's okay. The first one, 3.3, Thurrock has seen a 29% increase in EHCPs in 3 years. Is the national increase similar to Thurrock's?
Yes, the short answer to that is there has been a very significant national increase. Whereas we are slightly above. Sorry, Michelle, are you going to come in as well on that? We have the figures in front of you. I've got further figures if you need them.
Yeah, thank you. We are slightly above national and our statistical neighbours. We are looking at that. We're going to do something that we'd call a deep dive into what are the reasons for that. We think we know some of the reasons, but actually we'd like someone external to come in and just look at that for us, because national's around 4%, we're at 6%, so we are higher. It's difficult though, colleagues, with national, because you know, all local authorities are very different, so it's quite difficult, but we're higher than statistical neighbours as well, so it is something that we do need to look at.
Thank you for that. 3.5, without reading the whole paragraph, confirmed that more children and young persons than ever before are being identified as having SEND. Can you just explain why that is, please?
Why? Yeah. Why more children are being identified as having SEND? I think there's no question when I'm talking about the significant challenges that we face around children in primary school that we are facing an unprecedented increase in the number of children with very complex needs coming into primary school. Certainly I've been working in Thurrock for over 20 years. We have never had this number of children with that complexity of need, and I think that's for a wide range of reasons. Often we are asked, is there a change within the population? Is this about increased identification around autism, or is it about population change? I think it's unquestionable that within Thurrock we've seen, given the complexity of those needs, the fact we're talking about children with working at a very early developmental level who are pre-verbal with very complex needs, so we're seeing a huge increase in those needs. We are also, though, I should say, seeing an increase in needs across other areas as well. So one of the obvious areas that we are facing in terms of secondary schools are the increase in number of children identifying, again, either with social communication needs or autism, but with very high levels of anxiety. And of course, with the change from the 2014 Act, it brought in social, emotional and mental health specifically as the category of need, whereas previously we talked about we're more orientated towards behaviour needs, behaviour, emotional and social difficulties as a previous term. And that concept of mental health has brought another group of pupils' needs into the SEND system, which is a good thing in the sense we're identifying those needs, but that has certainly increased as well. And of course, we are still seeing post-COVID a significant increase in that anxiety and children having difficulties accessing schools, which impacts both on the SEND system, but also in terms of our medical requests for support, at schools where children are finding it difficult to attend in terms of emotional-based school avoidance. The other areas of need remain much the same. So hearing impairment over the years, visual impairment stays much the same. Broadly speaking, learning difficulties do. Though years ago, we would have had some pupils who have been identified for things like dyslexia. Very, very rarely would that come across now as a level. And I think that's an indicator of the types of needs that are being presented and the extent, rather than necessarily a change in the population. I think it's a way in which those are prioritised within school, and that's a challenge in terms. And schools are much better at supporting children with literacy difficulties as well than I would say they were 20 years ago. So they've got better programmes in place without necessarily coming through those systems. But certainly the autism is a significant increase. Social, emotional, mental health is a significant increase.
Okay, on, Chair? Yeah. Right. This is a very basic question, but it's going to be a detailed answer, sort of thing, I'd imagine. It sounds like we, as Thurrock as a whole, need more special schools. What are the complexities to having more special schools, and how would we go about that if we could?
So in order to get the free school at Treetops, or to get the extra, at the time when we were looking to increase the capacity at the Treetops, in effect, we talked obviously to Treetops School, we worked very closely with. And it was decided that the obvious option at that time, given where we were legislatively and in terms of the arrangements for new schools, was to seek a free school for them. So we went through that process, and I went up to the FD and we presented the case for the free school. But that obviously takes a significant period of time. In terms of the additional needs, we have the organisational structures in place to support the children through a special school system. So I wouldn't be anticipating, though this is obviously open for consultation and discussion, that we would seek a new school for children with autism. Autism is our biggest demand, obviously. So I think our most obvious route forward would be to have discussions with the existing special schools in terms of whether we'd be able to increase their numbers. But there are a whole range of issues around that, obviously both in terms of planning, in terms of the site, in terms of the organisation of the school as well. But that would be one of the several options we'd obviously need to consider as part of that. And we are beginning those conversations as we're aware of the timescale of children coming up through primary school.
Thank you for that. Sorry. With the home to school transport, how many drivers, helpers, personal assistants, I believe they're called, are legally required to the ratio of students per bus? And are we adhering to this?
Could you repeat your question? I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, sure. How many drivers, the home to school transport, how many drivers and helpers, which I think are called personal assistants, are legally required to the ratio of students per bus, and are we adhering to this?
We have a number of drivers, so we will have a driver per vehicle, and we will have at least one passenger assistant on a vehicle. It depends on the complexity of the children's needs, so there might be some vehicles that have more than one passenger assistant, but we would look at the needs of those children on the bus.
So following on from that, so what's the most we could have on a bus? Would it be 14, or so that'd be with maybe one helper, one driver, one personal assistant, or?
We do have 16-seater minibuses, and some of those will have one passenger assistant, some of those have two.
And that is following legal, it's okay legally, yes?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that. Just wait to find out. Thanks a lot. 8.2, the decision by Cabinet to approve the recommendation to change the home to school, I might be wording this wrong, but new people to come in. It says in 8.6 that this has meant that operators, drivers, passenger assistants have changed for most families. Students with SEN and SEND don't like change. Sorry, I keep turning this over, but so was this purely financial? In other words, a cheaper option, but surely that would be to the detriment of students not recognising a familiar face.
We are required, under procurement regulations, to renew our contracts. So we were required to go through the re-procurement of that contract, which was on a framework originally. And we've started going through that procurement cycle with a number of contracts still to go through. So every it's a 4-year contract with a 1-year extension. At that point, those contracts will change and those operators will change.
Is there any chance they could stay? Because, like I said, the students don't like change, do they? SEND students and that. So just asking.
We do appreciate that, that it's difficult. It's a difficult time for families, and they are anxious, and so are their children. but it's something that's agreed, you know, by Cabinet, so, and it's a procurement process that we have to follow. We do offer families an alternative, you know, from this year. We've allowed families to be able to have a personal travel budget, which we work with those families on, and that allows them to choose their own choice of transport. So if they want to do that themselves, or they have maybe a family friend or alternative options, that would give them consistency.
Thank you for that. Finished, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I think we may return to home to school transport in a later item. But as I say, thank you for those incisive questions. Anybody else got any questions that they would like to ask at this point? Okay, thank you for the responses. And we did have some questions that were raised before that were included in the report that is before this committee, which clearly we don't sit and read it all out. So those people who may be watching this via the ether or catching on it in later, you know, we do produce some fairly substantive reports with some detailed answers, and I'm very grateful to a lot of work that's gone in. This is the report on the item we've just discussed. The next item, I think we've got about 30 odd pages of very detailed information there. So we are sort of trying to put answers out there to the sort of questions. And I know, for example, the home to school has been a pretty emotive subject. And I didn't know whether it, as somebody who's been in the hot seat on that, whether Councillor Hartstein, have you got any thoughts you would like to say, or do you just... I just think, I know it's been a hot potato on your desk lately, and it will be interesting to see what your take is on home to school.
Yep, thank you, Chair. Obviously, there were issues at the start of the academic year, as there are in every local authority, in terms of homeschool transport that happens across the country. I just wanted to say that I know that the officers have been working really, really hard in terms of sorting all the issues out. And as far as I'm aware, I believe that all, if not nearly all of the issues have now been sorted out for the individual families that did have difficulties. But I would like to express my thanks in terms of how hard they have worked, because I do know the officers have been working hard on this.
Thank you, Councillor. Yeah, and I think those of us who are councillors, we get questions from the public, and as I say, whether anybody's watching this or not, if the public do have questions, please contact the members of this committee. We'll be, you know, more than happy. It's what we're here for, is to look into them and work with our officers to answer your questions. So, as I say, thanks to A, for some very incisive questions, B, for some very good answers, and C, for some reports. Just one question I've got, and it was about the situation relating to that Councillor Hurrell raised about the possibility of another special school. One of the things that I come across in local education is pressure on our, particularly primary schools, where they're having to use significant amounts of their resource to look after one or two children, whereby, you know, the parents want to put their children into a mainstream school. Sadly, and there's no, I mean, I was in Treetops myself the other day. It's the most wonderful place. And they do amazing work. So I don't think there's any stigma, but I can fully understand some parents do want to put their children into mainstream schools. So when you're having that thought process and that consultation, though, I think it would be helpful to go and engage with the heads and staff, SEN staff possibly, at the primaries as well, to get their take on what they think, because they may well say, look, if you could find another special school in Thurrock, it would be of immense advantage to us, because we want to give the best opportunity to all children. And I know there's an element that some of the brighter, I forget there is a phrase for it, whatever it is, the brighter kids, in some instances are not getting the resource, because the resource has been funneled into a really urgent need for those less able. And it's a bit of a sort of dichotomy of how they spread the money up. So I think we need an all-round picture as we go forward. So thank you very much for what you've done. Those officers, we go through the evening, once your time in the hot chair is done and you can get off home to your families, please feel free to depart. That isn't a problem. So we'll move. Everybody happy on that? Our co-opted members happy on that subject? Excellent. So in that case, we'll move on to our next item, which again relates to schools, which is the pupil place plan and agenda. And as I say, there's some fantastic maps and information in the report, which is very difficult to touch on verbally. But I will hand over to Sarah Williams to present that report, please.
Thank you, Chair. And, you know, as you quite rightly said, there are lots of maps in the appendix document if you wanted to go and have a little look through there. The pupil place plan is what we refer to, I'll refer to it as our PPP document. It's something that we produce on an annual basis. It's a statutory requirement, so it's something that we as a council have to do. We have to provide places for children of school age who live in Thurrock and whose parents would like them educated within the borough. It's pupil place planning requirements. We review them not just on an annual basis, but a number of times through the year, and we have monthly meetings where we meet with early years, we look at transport, we meet with finance. So there's a number of colleagues across the council that we work with and look at our sort of pupil place planning forecasts, which are 5-year forecasts. That data is based on birth. It used to be based on birth data. We now look at GP data. And the reason we do that is because it's more accurate than the birth data. That GP data is provided to us by the Department for Education. So we use that to do all of our forecasting. It's very complex, is what I would say, and it's challenging at times because we also have to consider what happens in year. Families moving into the borough, moving into Thurrock from outside of England. So, you know, we do have lots of considerations and factors that we sort of consider as we go along. We have as well, as part of that, brought together our home to school transport and school admissions, because it helps us then to try and identify where there might be some local solutions, where we can work as a team and try to reduce the impact on home to school transport where we might not be able to offer local places. Quite often, you as members, you know, will receive emails and communication from your residents when we can't always offer the school that's on their doorstep, and that's because those places become full quite quickly, particularly when families move in year. And I think it's probably quite important to note that. We refer to pupil admission numbers as our, you know, I'll talk about PAN, you'll hear PAN quite a lot. That's our pupil admission numbers. Schools required to formally consult with us. So you'll see in my report there's a number of schools that have reduced their PANs, primary and secondary. They are allowed to do that. They can do that on an annual basis. They do consult with us as well as other schools in the area. We will respond formally to those consultations, but you know, we may suggest that actually we don't think that that's a good idea, and we will cite around insufficient places and you know, sort of talk about in-year admissions, but they are still able to do that, which does place a risk on the council because we still have that statutory duty to provide those places for those children that want them. After reaching our peak of births, that was 2015-16, we are now seeing a decline, not just in Thurrock but nationally in our birth data. So our birth rate is coming down. But what I would say is that in-year applications are, you know, still coming through, you know, and we are seeing lots of families moving into Thurrock, not just from outside of England, but from other parts of the country as well. And, you know, we work really closely with schools and our academies to create additional spaces. So quite often we will be looking at bulge classes, we might be looking at expansions. Those reports, you know, have been to overview and scrutiny in previous years. So we do work really closely with our schools to see where we can open additional classes. It's not always possible, and they might not always be where we want them in the particular planning areas. What we're trying to do now, and just as an example, we're looking at a couple of our year groups in our central planning area, and we're trying to keep them centrally because we're also considering the impact on our home to school transport and, you know, what that means financially and, you know, and once they become eligible. So we try to sort of look at those things as well. A quick update on some of our free school delivery. So Orset Heath have now opened this September that were in their temporary accommodation. They're now operating at a full pan of 240 per year group. You may remember, or you may know that last year they didn't have the capacity within the temporary site. So there actually isn't a year 8 group that's in operation there. So they've now started back at year 7. We talked about our sort of 5-year plan, and probably the only thing I would add now is really around our local plan. And so because of the impact of the local plan, you know, not being delayed at the moment, that then has an impact on housing developments coming through the system, which then impacts on our forecasting. So, you know, we are starting to see some of those housing developments come forward for consultation, where we will provide responses on those. And as we see, you know, housing development moving, then, you know, of course, that will impact our forecasting and probably more so our plan for next year. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I believe we have some questions that have been from Councillor Coxwell.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the report. Just that as a child who was displaced, I'd say, but growing up in 2011, I lived in Purfleet and I went to school over in Stamford-le-Hope, so I know how difficult it is trying to juggle school places. And I was one of those arrived in 2010, just not really in time for proper times of looking at placements. Just really, I think, coming off that, it's mentioned at the end, the local plan. And I think that 18-month delay and how that actually impacts on what we're doing in terms of if sites were trying to be promoted that included schools, especially I know there's some sites that were looking in Chadwell. We're trying to look at developing a new school in there for East Tilbury in the Chadwell area. I think it's just mindful. I don't know how early engagement you have. Is it at point of submission of any planning application, or given that the delay, are we actually having conversations with promoters to actually talk about sites, not in any favour, but actually trying to give yourselves some idea perhaps on actually where you're trying to predict school places are for 5 years and all the plan next year, etc.
Thank you. We do work quite closely with our planning team, actually, and so when the local plan was developed, you know, and all the way through, you know, they have consulted with us. We've talked about what the need for schools and where those places might be needed, and we will continue those conversations with them. So, you know, as things change, you know, we will work with them on the school places. And in terms of planning applications that are coming through, we get that early engagement when they are consulting with all consultees. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, Councillor Heath.
Thank you. I think you answered 2 of my questions in your report. The other question I've got is, does the council have any statutory powers if a governing body decides not to increase their PAN, as there is a financial risk to the council in regards to transport?
Thank you. Unfortunately, we don't have statutory power. So whilst we have a statutory duty, because our schools are academies, we don't have that power. But, you know, as I said, that we do work closely. You know, we work in partnership with all of our primary and secondary schools. And we also discuss with the Department for Education when we have a shortage of places. We also, in terms of the DfE's, you know, pupil place planning team. And Michelle regularly meets with the regional schools director.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Anyone else? If I may just sort of jump on the back of that question. We hear an awful lot about silo working, and you've touched on the fact that you do try and work with planning as much as you can. As an outsider looking in, and someone who's sat in on a number of sort of assistant directorship appointments where this issue of interdepartmental cooperation comes up, again, this is more an observation, I suppose, than a question. But I really do hope that we start to see some really solid lines of communication written out and drilled down and enforced, because I've seen quite a lot of Section 106 agreements, i.e. a developer comes along, says I'm going to do X, Y and Z, it goes through planning, a few months later, you see an amendment to the application. Can we divest ourselves because it's no longer economically viable, blah, 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 and these things happen. And I think once a planning permission is given and once a section 106 is given, which will have a considerable educational impact. I mean, education and health are the two of the main things that come up on any significant planning application, and it should be on many of the smaller planning applications. And in fact, they're the ones who get away with it worse many times. So are you confident that going forward, we really will start to build into our planning? And it's a huge shame the local plan's gone back 2 years. And I know there are going to be questions at full council about why that is so, but that's for another day and another debate. But you know, can you give us some assurance that it's very easy to talk about working together, but do you get the sense coming down from the top that there is a real determination now to make sure if we have a plan, if we give permission for a housing estate, whether it's 50 houses, 100 houses, 200 houses, that the commitment to education and to health, in truth, does happen? Because I'm sick to the back teeth of seeing developers come back saying, oh, actually now we got our sums wrong and it's not financially viable. Well, I don't care, because you've got the people in the houses, and we as a council shouldn't have to pick up the cost. Sorry for spouting, but I'd like to know that you have that same conviction.
Yeah, I totally agree. And what I would say is that we have worked for a very long time very closely with planning on planning applications, Section 106 agreements, so they do ask for input for our input into those. And we have had successful Section 106 contributions that we have spent in previous years on schools and increasing school places. So, you know, that has been really positive, I think, for us. I think it's been a lot quieter lately because we haven't had the planning applications coming through. But, you know, as I said, we are consulted at a very early stage, and we are really clear about where we need the, you know, those Section 106 contributions for primary, secondary, and also, in addition now, home to school transport.
Thank you for that. As I say, it strikes a personal note with me, because I had a child that went through the huge bulge year that went through St Clair's, and you know, congratulations to the Osborne Trust for getting that cohort through, and they've left now. But it was 6 or 7 years of pretty much hell for some of the students and pretty much hell for Osborne, and I don't think that it was as well planned and supported as it could have been. But hopefully we'll never have a bulge year of that significance again. But thank you very much, and if you contribute, as I say, feel free to shoot on. So at which point everybody is happy with the questions. Nobody got anything else to. And again, I will always ask this: portfolio holders, any comments that you wish to make? You happy? I mean, sorry, Councillor.
Yep, sorry, no, nothing on this item.
Yeah,
thank you, Chair.
and Councillor Hooper, housing and pressures of housing, very much, I know, on your agenda. Anything that you'd like to make as an observation?
No, I agree with you 100%, Chair.
Good heavens. Right, well, in which case we will move on to the next item on the agenda, and this is where IT is going to come to the fore. And Claire and Carly have been sat there manning the controls. If you thought getting SpaceX down was difficult, see what we can do now. And so the next item is the financial performance, some very disturbing figures of the Mid and South Essex Foundation Trust. And we're going to get a presentation via Teams from Dawn Scrawfield from the Trust. So hopefully Dawn is on hand.
Chair, sorry to interrupt you, Chair.
Yes.
Have you not got recommendations from the last item? Last two items? Are there no recommendations?
No, there's recommendations in the report.
Are they? There you go. You see, I should read it, shouldn't I?
Yep, I can hear you.
My apologies. If all else fails, go to the agenda, which I haven't got. Claire, can you help me out with the recommendations as written?
So for the special educational needs item, the recommendations were that the committee recognise a strong partnership with our schools that has enabled us to bring down our designated schools' high needs budget deficit over a number of years. the committee makes recommendations that support the work of the local area SEND/AP Partnership Board to ensure outcomes for children and young people to continue to improve through services which adequately meet their needs. So the committee is asked to review the pupil place plan, noting the areas within Thurrock that will require additional school places going forward.
Sorry, very good point. And I've been the first to moan that we don't do the recommendations, so I consider my wrist well and truly slapped, and thank you for spotting that. And after that very nice agreement, Councillor Hooper, I'll stick that one in the black book. So we move on to our version of SpaceX.
Hi. Lovely. Thank you very much. Apologies, I can't see anyone, so please do guide me if anyone wishes to ask a question. So good evening, I'm Dawn Scrapill, Chief Finance Officer for Mid and South Essex Foundation Trust, and I've been asked to bring an update to your meeting with regards to the financial position of the Trust. I hope you've all had sight of the paper that was shared in advance. Unfortunately, as you can see from the paper, our financial challenges continue with a level of deficit in the organisation. We're planned for the beginning of the year at £84.6 million, and that includes productivity efficiency requirements of just over 91 million across the whole of the trust. So that covers obviously the Basildon and Thurrock area, but also Broomfield and Southend. At the end of August, we were just over £66 million in deficit. And some of the reason for that is linked to some of our improving value programmes not yet realising the benefits. So we've seen reduction, for example, in our length of stay in some of our beds, but we have still got quite high expenditure on some of our staffing, for example, where we're using still quite high levels of temporary staffing. We've also seen during the early part of the year higher spend on some of our non-pay, such as drugs and some of the consumables, which hasn't quite aligned with the level of activity that we're seeing. So we are in a recovery position, and we're working closely with staff around the best way to improve our productivity, but also make sure that we are not using resources that are outside of our plan. So, for example, we've been focusing on measures such as reducing our patient length of stay in our beds, because we know that it's better for patients to be discharged home with appropriate care, and also reducing, where possible, some of our headcount in our workforce. We've also been taking action to reduce a level of agency across the market. There is a lot less agency across the country that's now being used, and we are, just in the same way that other hospitals across the country are reducing temporary staffing, we're doing the same. Unfortunately, we are in National Oversight Framework segment 4, which means that we're in special measures with regards to our financial position. And that means that there are a number of other regimes that we are having to adhere to, such as what's described as a triple lock, which means that we are unable to approve our own expenditure, that we need to work with our regional and system partners with regards to sign off of costs. And obviously we're in financial turnaround. So we've been working with our system partners around the best way to manage that position. And one of the things that we're very much focused on in the Trust is around how we improve our productivity. There are quite a lot of national benchmarks that show that we have opportunities to improve our productivity, such as I've mentioned already, length of stay, but also we know that there are opportunities through the use of medicine to continue to improve a length of stay with things like elective day cases instead of inpatients, and there are national benchmarks to show that there is opportunities to improve those treatments. But also we can see that the level of ratio of staffing that we now have compared to the level of activity that we were delivering prior to the COVID phase shows that there is opportunity for us to deliver more care for our population, which is what we're striving to do. Obviously, all of that is a challenge given the financial backdrop, and we do need to ensure that we are planning appropriately for the cash that we need to cover the remainder of the financial year. So we do need to make sure that we tightly manage over the remaining months, and that's why we are very much in turnaround with colleagues working with a regime called the investigation and intervention regime, which we're working with our NHS England partners on. The size of our productivity and improving value programme, which is essentially a cost improvement programme, is quite significant. It's £91.5 million for the financial year. And we have been working very hard with our staff and with ideas from patients and, as I said, national benchmarks that show that we've got opportunities. And so far, at the end of month 5, we have over £73 million worth of schemes that we've got project documentation for. And we have a summary of how that is profiled, and we have over £40 million of that in Gateway 5, which is our delivery gateway. And we've got other programmes identified to be able to meet the remainder of the requirement with the work that we're doing for the remainder of the year. So I'm probably happy to stop there and very happy to answer questions if colleagues have got questions.
Hopefully there are. So any questions, members? Yeah, Councillor Manuel, start, and then Councillor.
Thank you for that report. My question is to do with the overspend. So you mentioned that we're currently in a special sort of intervention as a result of the high deficit which we have. Are there any particular reasons why we're in that position?
Yeah, so we are in that position because when we, prior to during COVID period, we received additional funding, which required us to open additional capacity, escalation beds, and during COVID, there were a lot of loss of productivity where we effectively had to put in place additional infection prevention control regimes. And what happened during that 2-year period was that effectively some of the productivity gains that we were achieving, we lost as we responded obviously to that requirement. Our length of stay increased, and it meant that we had larger volumes of patients in our beds for longer periods of time, which meant that obviously the number of beds that we were needing was increasing, and that meant that the cost of covering those beds was increasing as well. And what we're trying to do is restore back the levels of productivity prior to the period of COVID. Also, we have done extremely well as a trust in recruiting into vacancies, but we've still got some gaps. But what we haven't done is stepped down the use of temporary staffing, and that's obviously connected with the flow and capacity for beds across the trust. So there are a number of reasons for that. The other reason, last year we delivered over £70 million worth of efficiency savings, but just over £50 million of those were non-recurrent, which meant that we had to deliver those savings again in this financial year. So what we're really trying to do is ensure that we're delivering efficiencies recurrently to avoid the repeated requirement to deliver them in future years.
Thank you for that. I've got just another follow-up question to that. So you mentioned COVID as being like one of the main reasons why we're in this position, but surely COVID was something that impacted kind of trusts and everyone all over the country. And if we're in special sort of intervention measures, that would imply that we're in the minority, or unless I'm mistaken, and this is something that we're seeing up and down the country, which you can obviously inform me about. But I'm just wondering, aside from COVID, which was obviously like a national sort of thing, is there any other reason why we are in this position in the first place?
So I think COVID is quite a significant factor in terms of recovering from COVID, and also just generating a sustained level of efficiency. So if you look at the profile of efficiency savings, the NHS expects somewhere between 1% and 2% of efficiency every single year. And obviously in periods of austerity, that efficiency requirement is higher. During the COVID period, we didn't deliver that level of efficiency. And as I mentioned, last year, we didn't deliver the level of efficiency recurrently. So that means that that's having a hangover effect into the next financial year. So if you look at our productivity measures, we've received additional funding to treat more patients for elective recovery, for example, and we're doing very well around improving our elective recovery arrangements and delivering more care for the population. But relatively, when you look at our productivity, there is more care that we could offer for the relative sum of money. So it's just about making sure that we're maximising the use of public funding.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Fish.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm looking at the measures that you're using to address the deficit. Talk about reducing patient length of stay, and you said in your presentation that it's better for patients to go home as soon as possible, as soon as they're able to. That's not a new concept. People have known that for a long while, so I'm not sure how you're able to do more of that when surely that's your aim in the first place. If you catch my drift.
Yeah, so there's a number of reasons why we believe that that is possible. So certainly when we look at benchmark measures through surgery, for example, we can see that there are opportunities for some of our surgical procedures. And, you know, as an example, if you look back for heart cardiothoracic treatment, for example, previously patients were in hospital for more than 7 days, and now there is some procedures that patients go home within 24 hours. So all of the time we're trying to maximise the use of innovation and technology to allow speedier care for our patients. We also know that supporting patients home with the right packages of care means that they're likely to recover quicker in their own homes. And I know that a lot of work has been done around that. So we've had a number of wards that have been open through escalation space since COVID. Over the last year, we've been closing those wards. So we have been seeing a reduction in length of stay with the work across the community to be able to achieve that.
And how do you ensure that the packages that you put in place are effective when patients go home?
So some of that we measure through our readmission rates. So obviously readmission is something that we pay close attention to. But obviously we're also mindful with the population at certain stages of the year, the higher acuity level. So as we come into winter, we recognise that that will be an ongoing pressure that we need to manage. So packages of care, obviously we'll keep a close eye on in terms of the readmission rates and also the length of stay within community partners. So one of the other things that we're working with our partners on is making sure that if we're supporting patients to be cared for in a more appropriate place that's not the acute hospital, because we do appreciate that a long length of stays in acute hospitals doesn't necessarily give better outcomes for patients in recovery, but equally long length of stays in community beds is not always necessarily something that is beneficial for patients in care. So in their own homes is obviously much more preferable.
Anyone else got a question? Yeah, Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sorry, the report's in a completely different manner to what I'm used to seeing. It's very sort of bullet pointy. So you give your three main reasons, why it's overspent, and the middle one being too high expenditure on staff, which I think you said was around agency staff, which you've put down here that you're going to stop using agency staff, which are fine, that's great. But he also says you're reducing headcount and managing vacancies. If you've got such a high dependency on agency staff, how can you reduce headcount as well?
Yeah, so we have, in terms of establishment, we identify that we probably need closer to just over 16,000 whole-time equivalents. And at the end of last financial year, we had over 17,000 whole-time equivalents being worked. And what that means is that we've obviously got a lot of temporary staffing that are working on a month-by-month basis. So we actually had about 1,500 vacancies at the end of last financial year in March 2024. And we were filling vacancies in excess of 1,800 per month. So we know that we've got vacancies and we know that we're covering with a lot of temporary staff. Those vacancies are coming down because we're reducing the number of established posts, which means that we won't be filling those posts. Obviously, we're protecting frontline capacity to ensure that we're necessarily redeploying staff appropriately. So we think that there is quite a lot of flexibility for us to be able to do that. Of course, it's not as easy as that because there are ingrained custom and practice in terms of how we organise our services. So just like many public sector services, we are obviously trying to organise the way in which we work to make sure that we're maximising the use of our workforce, which is our biggest asset.
Thank you. I mean, that explains it a lot more, but could you put any numbers on that? Like by reducing headcount or managing vacancies, what kind of percentage of that deficit might that clear or help to clear? Are you able to do that?
Yeah, so in terms of the financial plan for this year, we were anticipating a reduction of about £10 million associated with workforce spending and full year effects closer to £36 million. So reduction in pay. And just to set that into context, we spend over £900 million on pay per annum.
Yes, Kim.
Thank you, Chair. I know, Dawn, that you're probably not likely to be able to answer this, but I really feel it has to be noted at this meeting. I'm going to follow on from Councillor Fish around the discharge, reducing the length of stay and the discharges. We at Health Watch have just completed a 10-month piece of work around hospital discharge, and it's been quite eye-opening to find the amount of people who are being discharged from hospital who are not fit to be discharged. The packages of care have not been put in place. We have community professionals saying that they have serious concerns about the safety and welfare of patients being discharged. And I believe that the new way of working it out is that patients are medically optimised for discharge as opposed to fit for discharge, which means that they come home still with quite a lot of needs. Now, I fully accept what you've said about the new way forward with lots of innovation, and people are, following some surgeries, are able to be discharged earlier. There are probably a lot of people that maybe have got another relative living with them or parents, but the very elderly and the very frail, unfortunately, in the community are not being best served. Now, our report will be coming out. There is already, but I just feel that it needs to be noted that it isn't as simple as length of stays because of the move forward in the surgeries. There is also this medically optimised problem, which means that some are just not fit for discharge and they are coming back in again. So I just wanted that noted really, because obviously when our report comes to here and comes to various boards, it's going to be raised. So I just needed to say that we've always been under the impression that people are discharged early because of the bed space. There are people in A&E waiting, not really because you're trying to cut down costs. That makes it even worse to us. It was more of a statement than a question. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think, thank you, Kim. I think I can actually back that up with a question on the same, more or less on the same lines. When people go to hospital, it's generally because there's something wrong with them. They've either been in an accident and suffered an injury, or they're ill. And you sort of talk in your report about shortening the length of stay and discharge and whatever, and relating it to financial issues. Surely discharge from hospital should purely be a clinical decision by a doctor who looks at the case history of the person involved and says, no, they can't go home because they're not well enough to go home. And they shouldn't be put under any pressure to shift that bed on because it fits a balance sheet. And the people, you know, we get the sense of this, and I think Kim alluded to that. This is what we're seeing. We all know, I'm sure. I get it as casework. Kim from Health Watch gets it from people ringing up to cry on their, you know, to cry on their shoulder. You know, we should not be discharging people. It's the National Health Service. It's there to look after people and get them better, not to match your balance sheet. So can you just explain how it works? As a, you know, is it a clinical decision to send people home, or is it a financial decision?
Yeah, so let me just reassure yourself and the members of the public that it's absolutely a clinical decision. There are clinical decision makers and there are clinical protocols that are followed to ensure that patients that are discharged are obviously fit to be discharged. I think it comes back to the point around modern medicine though. So we have same day emergency areas that mean that we have the ability to support patients being assessed and turned around on the same day. In fact, we do have a lot of emergency responsiveness at our front door now, which means that when you look at our numbers of admissions and inpatients from emergency attendances, our actual numbers of emergency admissions haven't increased in the same proportion as our A&E attendances. But what has happened is that the length of stay for the patients that are being admitted has been increasing. And in fact, when you compare the length of admissions compared to pre-COVID, it is longer, which is why we've had a high number of escalation beds that are opened for caring for patients with longer length of stay. So that we can see a difference in the way that we're working, which is improving the turnaround. That obviously the volumes of ambulances means that we've been able to manage some of that care and turn around patients appropriately at the front door, but it's absolutely a clinical decision. No accountants are involved in the assessment of patients in that process. But obviously we need to make sure that it's the whole system working together, because it's actually not good for patient outcomes to have people in hospital for longer periods of time if they're not mobilised for rehabilitation following a period of illness. And the hospital is not necessarily the right place for that. So we recognise that and wish to support that.
Okay, thank you, and I appreciate you're in the hot seat, and I genuinely appreciate you coming to speak to us this evening. But so I can take it from that you've just said, that, and I'll ask a very straightforward question. You can assure this committee and the residents of Thurrock that there will not be any instance going forwards of a doctor saying that person shouldn't go home and that decision being overruled on the basis of finance. You can give us an unequivocal statement that that will not happen.
So as a Chief Finance Officer, I can assure you that there would not be a member of my team that overturns a doctor's opinion about a clinical need for a patient to be in the hospital.
Thank you for that. I mean, it'll be interesting when we next hear, although they've just had the industrial actions gone, but when junior doctors and senior doctors are telling us about the pressures they work under, that clearly we can put that to them. I think just to touch on what I believe, well, I'll just ask my question that Councillor Johnson touched on. We're here to represent the people of Thurrock this evening. Thurrock continues to get the short end of the stick regarding your trust and the way the trust has developed, because I started this meeting by paying tribute to Margaret Jones, and she and I sat on the board at the Hospital Trust more than a decade and a half ago, and we were hearing phrases then, and you came out with them talking about productivity and increasing value and all the diatribe that goes as if you're looking on a balance sheet on a Ford's production line. And you know, I don't feel that we're moving forward in terms of and I don't blame you, and I don't blame any members of the trust. I think, you know, it's a sort of philosophical discussion at a higher level about how we run and manage our health service. When that happened, when Margaret and I were on that board, and other councillors, Councillor Arnold, I remember, was incredibly vociferous on behalf of people in Thurrock and got extremely angry with what was going on. But you know, we're not getting a sense of progress. And can I just be assured that the needs of Thurrock are being separated and looked at? I appreciate you've got other areas, but you know, when we were there at that time, we had the Thurrock PCT. It was based in Thurrock, and you know, the decision making was from Thurrock, and the contributions were from Thurrock, from the PCT. We then had the CC, and I'm talking about anagrams, the primary care trust. Then we had the clinical commissioning group, the CCG, and that's been removed, and we've now got the integrated care board, which I believe sits in Chelmsford, and appears, to my mind, very distanced from the needs of Thurrock. And I would just ask, can you give us an assurance that the needs of Thurrock will be given some priority? Because we've had, for decades, the short end of the shift. We've got a hospital that your trust acknowledges has needs. I think the latest figure is £12 million worth of repairs just to make it functional and safe. Not to improve it, to make it functional and safe. That's not going to happen. You and I know that's not going to happen because the money isn't there. But I'm fed up, and I just would like a commitment. And I think it goes back to what Councillor Johnson said. You know, we asked for a detailed report. We've got a couple of graphs, tables, and a few words. I don't get much comfort from what you brought to us this evening. I don't see any solutions. I don't see any real explanation of this catastrophic debt that you're just bundling over from year to year to year to year. But I will ask the question again, as the Chief Finance Officer, can you give us an assurance that Thurrock is very much a priority for your trust?
Yeah. So if I can just start off by saying I used to work for Thurrock PCT. I was part of the finance department, so I'm very familiar with how that operated, and also appreciate the importance of population health. So from my perspective, the key relationships are through the alliances, and I sit here this evening talking to you about the position of the acute, very much aware that actually the acute is only part of the picture. We have to work with the community, we have to work with local authority partners, and primary care is a crucial part of our delivery of care. So the way in which the organisation is structured, we have recently reaffirmed the managing director relationships. I believe you link in with people such as Michelle Stapleton and Fiona Ryan, who supports the cross-system working. So there is absolutely a recognition that we need to service the population across Mid and South Essex. And obviously Thurrock has a distinct population and needs just in the way that other parts of our population do as well. So yes, it is absolutely recognised and understood.
Thank you. Councillor Rigby.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Dawn. I've got a few questions, if that's okay. I'm going to go back to the beds. I know that we've talked about the beds a lot. But one of the issues I think often is, particularly with sort of patients that have maybe had a hip replacement, is that they can be in hospital for several weeks when it's not necessary for them to be so, but they can't go home because it's too difficult to manage them at home, and they're waiting for a space in a rehabilitation centre, you know, sort of midway. What is the progress on those sort of services? Because I'm sure if you were to go into any orthopaedic ward in Basildon now, there would be quite a few elderly people that had a hip operation a long time ago that are waiting to be discharged to go to somewhere suitable for ongoing care.
Yeah, and that's the whole purpose of the integrated discharge team. I mean, you mentioned hip replacements or hip operations. Actually, the pathway is that early mobilisation wherever possible is the better outcome for patients. And obviously, 24 to 48 hours now, people are leaving hospital post hip surgery. Now, clearly, obviously, if it's a frail person, the care package will need to take that into consideration, but mobilisation is a crucial part of that kind of surgery, and the rehabilitation arrangements wrap around patients to support that, and we've got good outcomes in terms of our hip replacement statistics. So
that seems pretty quick recovery for an elderly person having had a hip operation.
No, rehabilitation. So mobilisation is something that happens 24 to 48 hours. It depends. So my mum is 70. She's not long had her hip replaced, and she was out of hospital within 24 hours. But obviously, if it is an emergency, clearly the fragility potentially of the person that's fallen would be taken into consideration as part of the discharge arrangements. And there's an integrated discharge team that would support appropriate discharge according to the clinical needs and the dependency of the patient. And I know that Thurrock, we work closely with Thurrock around those arrangements. So Michelle Stapleton oversees our integrated discharge team and services.
Okay, so yes, so I experienced something very different when I was in Basildon. I came across quite a few elderly patients that had been in there for several weeks, and I didn't see many being mobilised 24 hours. I mean, I had my ankle operated on, and I couldn't really mobilise after 24 hours, so I'm not quite sure. I think it's pretty remarkable if your mother mobilised after 24 hours.
But that was a hip. So I think ankles are different, but yes, hip.
Yes. So obviously there's ongoing work with that. That's great. Another thing I want to refer back to, you mentioned about excessive use of consumables. What did you mean by that as what part of your cost expenditure?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've identified is that potentially ordering of consumables. So for example, clinical consumables that are required when we looked at the ratio of patients and drugs and the ratio of costs incurred, it didn't quite align with our activity volumes. So we were looking into whether or not there was perhaps stockpiling happening in some areas, or perhaps we weren't necessarily using the supply chain in the most efficient way. So that was what I was referring to. And we were following that up, and we're following that up to see if there's anything that can be done to improve that.
But I mean, if you're stockpiling, that would more affect cash flow because you could keep it going and then it's still used, isn't it? It's not that you're going to lose them the money on things like bandages, it's still okay to use in a year's time.
But it's also storage capacity, and also things get out of date, so we have to keep that up to date. So obviously things like the water, you know, there are consumable items that have a shelf life.
Stand, yeah, that's fine. So it's more about managing stock control on that aspect.
Yes.
And the use of private hospitals, private servicing. I think there's a lot of NHS patients that are going to sort of the Spire and Nuffield hospitals, for example. How is that a benefit? Is that a cost benefit? Does it cost you more? Does it cost you less? What are the sort of approaches to using private services to outsource?
Yeah, so certainly post-COVID, we did use a lot of the independent sector to support the recovery, because we just weren't able to mobilise sufficient capacity to be able to respond to meeting the reduction in waiting times that we committed to in terms of the ambition, because obviously we wanted to reduce the amount of waiting times for people that have been waiting post-COVID. Certainly the volume of activity that we now outsource to the independent sector directly from the trust is significantly reduced. I mean, obviously patients still have a choice, and that's something that our integrated care board supports, and obviously is available to patients. But the amount that the trust outsources is significantly less in this financial year. In terms of whether or not it costs more, it depends whether or not the trust gets paid a elective tariff. So that's a value per piece of activity, care, a hip, or offered for our population. It depends on the price that the independent sector charges as to whether or not that is a net cost or a break-even position to the trust to pass through.
So, how do you see that going forward? Because there are reports that the independent hospitals are going to be used more by the NHS to reduce waiting list. Is that not so much the feeling in Mid and South Essex then? Yeah, so I mean, we obviously have to ensure that we've got sufficient capacity to meet the demands of the population and to meet elective requirements. In the first instance, we're keen to ensure that we're maximising the use of our assets in the form of, our staff and our premises, and obviously our equipment, and everything, associated with providing care for our population. So that would be preferable for the system and for the trust to make use of our existing assets. But clearly, where the demand, and it may well be for a particular specialty, if we don't have sufficient medical capacity, then it may well be that we need to look at using alternative provision. Thank you,
Chair. Thank you very much, Councillor Rigby. I don't know whether it's protocol or whatever, but as we have you here, and we also have a knowledgeable observer, I just would like to ask if Sharon Stoltz, who's our sort of public health, Director of Public Health and our health champion, who's got probably forgotten more than I'll ever know about these issues. Do you have any observations, Sharon, that you could share with us, or possibly even questions? And I know you will have your one-to-one dialogue with fellow officers, but I'd just be interested to get your perception of how this health trust is performing. Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, that's fine. I mean, thank you for the presentation and for the really comprehensive responses to the questions so far. I think what we're hearing about our local trust is being repeated in hospitals across the country. We know that the NHS has had lower levels of investment through austerity. The NHS was in a difficult position going into the pandemic. And I think if any of you have been kind of following the COVID inquiry and perhaps have read the recent Darcy report, that illustrates very well that the NHS has experienced a double whammy. We've had years and years of underinvestment. We had the pandemic that had a massive impact, but we also have a sicker population. And we know that the COVID pandemic has created, and we see this in Thurrock particularly, that it's led to an increase, a significant increase in the number of people who are experiencing long-term health problems. And so I think none of us would like our local hospital to be in this position, but it's the reality of where the NHS is at the moment. I mean, I'm sure that Rob, my colleague here as Director of Adult Social Care, would agree. The answers to some of these problems don't lie just with a trust. They lie with the health and social care system. And so it's really important that the health, the NHS and social care systems are working really closely together. So we need to have a focus on prevention so that we're keeping people well for longer. That's obviously at the core of what I'm trying to do as the Director of Public Health for Thurrock, but also looking to see how we can pick people up with health problems early. And Kim earlier referred to some of the work that Healthwatch is doing. I think your reports will come through to the Health and Wellbeing Board, Kim. I'm sure we'll have a discussion there about how we can respond as a system. The community and voluntary sector also has a role in supporting this. So it's really difficult, I think, to look just to the hospital to resolve their financial problems and to address some of the really challenging issues around length of stay, discharging patients, how we support people when they come out of hospital, at home. They're really complex issues, but we have a Thurrock Integrated Care Alliance here. The hospital is represented on that. Rob and I are both on that. And so perhaps, Chair, Scrutiny may want to receive a report and presentation at some point about how we're working together through the Thurrock Integrated Care Alliance to be able to kind of really look at sustainable solutions. Some of the funding budget savings that have been described are short-term. They're what the hospital is having to do to try and balance the books, just as we as the council, we have to make decisions to balance our books. The hospital is in exactly the same position. But the only way we're going to come up with sustainable solutions is really to work together.
Thank you. Yeah. Good, Rob. You.
Can I just make one observation? So sorry, this is day 2, week 2 for me, so it's very early at the moment, and I've yet to meet my health colleagues, though meetings are planned over the coming days. I just want to support what Sharon was saying and say that generally a national situation, which I'm very keen to explore here, is, you'll probably be aware, a lot of the focus of the NHS tends to be at the back door, in the hospital, at the back door and getting people out. I think there's real opportunity, and what I see in Thurrock, there's really exciting opportunity to look at more at the front door and admission avoidance and looking at primary support services, working with social care, working with other council services, working with the voluntary and community sector around that whole kind of prevention, community intervention, trying to avoid people going to hospital in the first place and making sure that they're supported in primary community settings much better. Now, I've seen some really good work in Thurrock already. What I don't have at the moment is the details to kind of what the potential is to increase that more and how that plays out against the kind of the focus on the back door. But I would stress that I think one of the things we need to look at is that whole admission avoidance piece.
Thank you, Rob. I think, and Sharon was quite right, the Alliance has a huge role to play. And to be fair, and I know it's because one of the key movers has been ill, but systems shouldn't be dependent upon one person. And we did have a situation when this was a scrutiny of health and well-being, and as Councillor Coxall has clearly nodded, where we got regular reports and members of the Alliance were here to, and you are members of the Alliance in effect, but we did get that local feel, and I hope that will come back very quickly. As I say, we're here to look after Thurrock, and I was going to challenge you a little bit, but I'll leave that for another day, because and I'm only one person, a member of this committee. I welcome you what you say, but I do expect members, I believe members share the feeling that I've got from the evidence that's put before us, that everybody acknowledges Thurrock has got significant health problems. It is not the norm. It is worse than most areas. We've had the situation we spoke earlier on about the GPs. We've got issues with air. We've got issues with other health problems. We've got people coming into the borough at vast rates, all of which are piling pressures on Thurrock that some of the other areas don't have. Because, don't forget this hospitals trust sits in, and I'm going to be really unkind and say leafy mid-Essex, where the problems are completely different. I sometimes feel we get the short end of the stick, and we will on this committee, I'm sure, be challenging yourselves. I'm sure we will be challenging the trust. And I do thank Dawn for coming out and putting herself in the hot seat tonight. I'm grateful for the honesty. I'm grateful for the answers. I'm not sure we got all the answers that we want, but in accordance with my colleagues, and so I don't forget this time, can I ask this committee that we note the detail, which I think is quite interesting. We note the detail in the report and plans in place to reduce the financial deficit of the trust. Is that noted? Thank you very much indeed, Dawn. Cheers.
Thank you for your time.
Right, we move on to our final main agenda item, and once again we're talking money, I'm afraid. But it was pointed out that a significant role of scrutiny is to look at the financial aspects of the directorates that we are scrutinising, and so I hope this will become a regular part of our meetings and other scrutiny across the council platform. So at that point, to put forward our final main item of the evening, it's the Q1 Focus Revenue and Capital Outturn Report, Adult Social Services and Children's Services. And could I ask our corporate service leads to present, please? Well, whoever's going to present the report.
I will try going first then. So I'll assume the report has been read, so I won't introduce the report, which has the corporate picture about where we are on the financial position for the council, on its in-year budget position, other than to state there is that figure in there around £2 million on the general fund, which we are projected overspend, which we really need to look to address, and we'll be taking a corporate view on that one. I think what our scrutiny was looking for tonight was to get a Q1 update from adults and children's as to our budget position in those directorates. So possibly if I just start from an adult's point of view, and excuse me if I give you information which you don't want, or I'm not giving you enough information, but I just thought it might be useful just in explaining where we are in our Q1 budget position to just put it in the context of activity and who we look after in adult social care. So if you look on page 98, there is a table there which kind of gives an indication of the client groups we look after by older people, learning disability, physical disabilities. I'm assuming that will include sensory impairment in that description, and mental health, and then the different service types. So you'll see in that table, at a point in time in this year, because I think it is a point in time, because obviously through the year the numbers will vary a little bit. People come out of service, more people come into service. We're looking at around 2,000 people. The variation between the 2,100 and the 2,000 figure in the paragraph above is the fact there'll be a small number of people who will receive more than one service, which is how that's being counted. So in total, we're looking around a volume of 2,000 people. I'm going to come back to that in a second because I want that to be noted. That's therefore serviced by a budget in adult social care. The net budget of £55 million, which is further higher up in the report. And you'll see against that budget, we are forecasting an outturn at the moment of just over 54 million. So we are projecting an underspend at the current point on the general fund of 1.2 million. What that figure doesn't take into account is some of the grant figures we have. So Sharon is here, and if there's the public health grant, that's not in that figure. That's a ring-fence grant with very specific criteria around its spend. If you had any questions, it's in the paper, but I'm sure Sharon will be able to answer your any questions on that one. So I think the interesting bit from a Q1 point of view is to address the fact that we are projecting an underspend at the moment. What's the reason for that? It's in two broad areas. So it's in our external placement activity and in our provider services. The provider, if you bear with me, I don't have all the detail to all the activity and all the things that are happening. But what I really want to express to you is that we're managing the provider services budget very carefully through managing vacancies within that service and also the activity in that service. The other area, though, around the external placements, which is around £800,000 of that underspend, of that projected underspend, is around reduced placement activity. Now, what's the reason for that reduced placement activity? Again, just give you a bit of a number. So that's talking about a reduced number of people going into residential nursing care. Again, I've not got in my head all the different rates. Every care home will have a range of different rates, but we'll have a broad range that we spend per person. But to just give you an idea of the volume and the data against that 2,000, it says here we've got about 490 people in residential settings. If you looked at a care home, give it a ballpark figure. It's less in residential care than nursing care, but a ballpark figure of £50,000 per annum to keep somebody in residential care. So you're looking at £700,000, £800,000 reduction is probably, in figures terms, you'd say 15, it's probably nearer 20 people, because actually keeping people out of residential nursing care, they probably still do have eligible needs, so they probably are receiving a home care package, so they'll be being supported at a lower cost with a home care package. This is a good thing, generally, because remember that we're about trying to promote independence and and quality of life. And so keeping people out of a residential nursing setting is generally a positive thing. If we can delay or defer that as long as possible, that is actually provided that individual, and we are always person-centred in how we deliver our services. That's why that individual, hopefully with a better quality of life and more independence in their living. Now, the reason we're achieving this is because I think you may have heard previously around the direction, it links to possibly the previous conversation we've had around the integrated community locality teams and this multidisciplinary working in teams on locality base. We've got the hub. I've not visited them all yet. Corringham is up and running. The other three localities, there is multidisciplinary work happening, but they're not quite as developed, I understand, as the Corringham example. I'm going to visit that next week. I did go to a very impressive presentation last week at the Civic Hall around the locality working. Now, what that is beginning to evidence now and demonstrate is by working with people earlier in their communities, upstream to support, it means we're getting people earlier, we're managing to use locality assets, their own strengths within their families and their own networks to try and kind of improve the health and well-being and the care of people at a more upstream level. And that is now delivering efficiencies and the improved outcomes for those individuals. So that's the piece of work which is really helping to deliver the projected underspend that we're looking at the moment. Yesterday, I was involved in a meeting whereby we'll be looking the next meeting here, I will have the month 6 data, which will show a deep dive into all of the different savings lines for this year. So I'll have a more forensic understanding of exactly how we're achieving all the other lines. But I hope to just give you that overview for where we are at the moment. It's just over 1 million underspend. That's the main reason for it. And it's a key part of how we want to work in the future because it's the right thing to do for communities. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I mean, we'll move on to children. I mean, the idea here is to look at, I mean, and I'm grateful for all the figures, and Seema may well want to make an overview as well, because I appreciate that it's Dawn's report, but you're here, and it may well be that I'll sort of invite you to do that. But at this point, anybody got any questions specifically relating to the finances? Because that's what we're looking at of adult social care. We're all happy. Councillor Coxall.
Thank you, Chair. No, thank you, Rob. Appreciate it. It's early days for you being appointed. I'd just say welcome on board. You'll learn very quickly. There's some fantastic people here in Thurrock, and I know a lot of the work Ian and previous team were doing in terms of actually managing finances for adult social care. Over the last 12 months, consistently with trying to, although we say an underspend, it's good financially, it's making sure the right services are delivered at the right level for the right people and people are getting the care they need. And if we are able to do that while looking at new ways of working, the integrated locality teams are absolutely fantastic, and I'm really pleased that you'll see, I've already realised actually that is one of the really good assets for our team here in Thurrock. So I think as that works forward and as we develop those across the other PCN sectors, I think that there's still some opportunities, I believe, still to be had, but obviously very difficult. But it's always very difficult to prepare quarter by quarter, isn't it? It's but demand-led. So hopefully, if we keep things on track of where we are, I think we are actually in quite a good position for adult social care.
Yeah, my question would be that if we come in at year end, I think that's right, isn't it? You're looking at sort of 2 million underspend for year end, if it's the way I read it. I mean, an ideal, and nobody ever gets an ideal budget, you know, cut square at the end of the year. But if you continue the way you're doing in terms of your directorate, what happens to the money that we don't spend?
I don't know if I should. So my answer to that, I think the underspend is 1.2 million. That's it's a variance. That's a projection for what the end of year position would be. So it doesn't double. Is my understanding. But secondly, what I say is we operate as one council. So if we underspend, if there's a pressure elsewhere, it's about the council at the bottom achieving the bottom line of a balanced budget spend at the end of the year.
So that doesn't go on. You're not at liberty to spend that. That just goes back to the bank manager.
No, I'm sure there'll be a conversation. I'm sure that I'll be informed by Dawn. As my previous experience where I was previously and place previous to that is that if we've achieved underspends where I've been previously, and that goes in towards ensuring the council delivers its balanced budget position at the end of the year or as close to it as possible.
Yeah,
I'd be happy
because
with that
don't
approach.
forget, you know, the good people are paying in their council tax a little chunk that's got brackets around it saying adult social care. So we're chucking money into that pot for that very purpose. So and we'll no doubt be revisiting this as we go along. Sheila, would you like to give a summary of your department, if that's okay, or your directorate?
Yeah, sure. I think in terms of children's services, the biggest overspending area at the moment is placements, children's placements. And you'll see that in the charts and in the document you've got in front of you. We have got mitigations in place against our children's placements budget, and we have brought in Empower, a company, to work with us to start looking at what else we can do to try to bring down that spend. But bearing in mind, we've also got to look after children safely. So this is not a question of saying we won't provide the right care for children when they need it, because we will. There's also a particular need, and in the charts that you've got here, which sets out the actual placement, so placement type and placement cost. If you'll notice down here is that we have got more unregulated placements and costing significantly more than we'd budgeted for. So that's an area for us that we've got absolute focus on. We do get health contribution towards our placement costs, which is really good, and not all children's services manage that. And sometimes as well we get remand costs. So for example, if a child is remanded into custody before they're convicted of an offence, it's the local authority that will pay for that child to be in custody until there's a conviction and or they're released. In terms of the DSG, the overspend there is almost exclusively against the high needs block, and that's the conversation we've been having about SEND, EHCPs, etc. Although that is an overspend that we're projecting on the DSG, which is the schools devolved schools grant, that's actually a relatively low overspend compared to when you compare ourselves to other councils. And we're also involved in a delivering best value programme where we've had some funding in year of £1 million to try to help us to bring that overspend down, and we're focusing on prevention. So that's what we're really focusing on, to prevent needs escalating so that they require those higher need block interventions. We also have pressures in our children's budgets against leaving care, and that's primarily, again, it's a placement related issue, but when young people are ready to leave care and to take up a tenancy, we don't always have the homes to move them and to allow them to move into. So that means young people are waiting in a placement that we're paying quite a lot of money for weekly because they can't, and we haven't got a property for them to move into. Home to school transport, we're also flagging, as everybody's aware, we've got a new procured service. It's only been operating since September. I don't think it was actually in this, because this is Q1. I think obviously we know some of these budgets have moved on since then. So although we're reporting on Q1, we know that there have been some movement there. But home to school transport is another big area of spend and overspending for children's services. So we've got their mitigations that we were talking about. Unless there's other questions, I'm not sure.
Colleagues, questions? Yeah, Councillor Heath.
Thank you, Chair. The children that are in unregulated placements, are the placements working with Ofsted to become regulated? And if so, what are the timeframes? And is there a financial benefit to the council if they do become regulated?
Thank you. All of the children that we've currently got in unregulated placements, and since this report, it was 6, it's now 5, we always go straight for looking for them to be registered by Ofsted. One of the 5 is being registered by CQC because that's an older child, and we would want that placement to be registered so it can take them through to transition. So all placements have got the documents in place for registration. It takes variable time because Ofsted have to allocate an inspector to each of those requests. We are not the only authority that have got unregulated placements. So up and down the country, Ofsted have got quite a lot of requests to regulate placements. So it varies. It can take 3 or 4 months up to maybe 9 months or a year to get a placement regulated by Ofsted. In terms of costs, the costs really are about the complexity of the need of the children. So even when they're in an unregulated placement, we treat those placements as if they were not necessarily regulated, but we have visits constantly to those placements. We have placement panels who review the care that's on offer to the children. And quite often the costs are associated with high levels of individual support. So you can have some children on 4-to-1 support. What we try to do while the children are in those placements is reassess them constantly to be saying, should it be 4-to-1, can it be 3-to-1, can it be 2-to-1? Because it's not really normal for any child to have 3 or 4 adults solely on them all the time. So we do bring the cost down even before they're actually registered. In terms of savings, in terms of costs, that it usually is slightly less expensive for us once we get them registered. I think part of that is because the crisis has gone, because it takes a length of time to get registered, and in that period of time, the needs of the child are constantly assessed and usually de-escalate from the point of when they became looked after in that place.
Thank you, that's really helpful, thanks. Thanks, Chair.
Anybody else got any specific questions on? Yeah, Councillor Johnson.
It's not really on children's, Sheila, so relax. Unless I'm missing something here, the total service position is showing a 3 million overspend. Then when you read down into the second paragraph, 1.2 million pound of that is an overestimation of the compensation we were allowed to claim. Can anyone explain where that come from, how that, I mean, because I was in Cabinet for a long while and that's the first I've ever heard of this.
Yes, Councillor. So during the COVID period, the government allowed all local authorities to claim back, to estimate what they thought they would lose in sales fees and charges income, and put in that estimate and claim some grant from central government. And for some unknown reason, we overclaimed.
Have an unknown reason.
Well, they estimated what they thought. It was based on what we thought. It was all the income they thought that we would lose in terms of libraries, parking charges, fees and charges across the whole council. And when they submitted the claim to central government, it was overestimated by 1.2 million. And we're just holding that at the moment, just in case, on the accounts, just in case the government want to claim that back from us.
Feel free.
That's more than half of what we actually claimed in the first place. I'd like a much more detailed report to see where those specific overestimations were, because, and as I said, why has it only come to light now?
It was known immediately, so it has been part of the original Cabinet report. There is a chapter in there, and Corporate Overview and Scrutiny have also asked for a response, so that will be provided as well to all the Overview and Scrutinies.
Because you know, overall, I don't think the position's that bad, to be perfectly honest, in Q1. I think it's, you know, it's quite workable, but that just stands out like a sore thumb.
We have got an amount in reserves that we have kept aside for that, so it is being offset. And we have got an amount in reserves that we're using for the homelessness pressure as well. So 2 million overspend. What we're trying to do is make sure all services come up with their mitigation plans to make sure that we come to a balanced budget at the end of the year. And progress has already started with that, and you will see that in the Q2 report, which will show the movement between Q2 and Q1 and Q2.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. I've got something to follow on from that in a minute, but this is obviously Q1's June. It's done and dusted. These are the figures. Even if, as Councillor Johnson rightly points out, there are still some big question marks. Where are we sitting for, obviously, Q2?
So
I appreciate it's an estimate.
No idea at the moment, because they've only just started meeting all the budget holders, but Q2 will be done by next week as they've met all the budget holders and they start finalising the figures.
Sorry, I'm now joining Barry and shaking my head. We don't know at the moment, but we will do next week on multi-million-pound budgets. I just don't get it. You know, I mean, our job here is to ask what's going on with accounting. I mean, I'll just throw in the hand grenade I was going to chuck in a minute, because I read to the end of the report where you're making comparisons against capital and then the HRA and all the rest of it. And there's a line just sneaked in there that talks about one of the things we don't know about is the level of compensation that we're going to have to pay out for the A13. I mean, I nearly fell off my chair when I read that. I mean, the A13's been done for 2 years now. It just beggars belief how bad we are. And I do apologise, you knew and whatever, but I can sit here and have a moan about the Hospitals Trust, but, you know, that's pot calling kettle black, because we are not getting a grip on our finances. We really aren't. And we have to. It's crucial. If we're going to get the bill of health from the commissioners or whoever it is going to give us our end of year report, you know, we have to get better, Seema. We really, they can't be these, I can't tell you now. We're now nearly halfway through October.
So I can assure you that we have got a lot of the financial procedures now sitting and waiting in train to get into place. We are currently compiling all the Q2 figures with each of the service, because they need to go through the corporate directors to clear them before we start collating all the figures, as all of my staff meet with each of the corporate directors. So I do apologise, but the figures are being worked on currently. And there are some other aspects of work that are being improved on as the new staff get up to speed.
Shade, of course, yeah.
I hope it's sort of reassurance to the committee. We do meet regularly with our finance colleagues, and if there's any movement, you know, if something's moving in the wrong direction, we know that really quickly, and we do take as much action as we can, you know, in the moment to try to reduce any expenditure. It's just the compiling of the reports and getting them written in a way that they can be produced. But you know, and I'm sure Rob will say, you know, I know you've only been here a short while, but I meet really regularly with finance colleagues to go over all the finance data, you know, regularly.
Sorry, I'm not pointing a finger of blame, and certainly not at the SLT at this point in time. That may come at a later date. But, you know, we keep getting told, we're on an improvement journey as a council, and I apologise for being on a rant, councillors, but maybe I'm thinking what some of you are thinking. You know, we're virtually, we're a couple of weeks away from the end of that second quarter. I'll take it down to a jukebox jury moment. Are we going to hit or miss in Q2?
I think the figures will be improved on Q1.
Thank you. Anybody else got any questions? Excellent. Thank you very much, and thanks for fronting up. And you know, it is our job. And I would also mention to our two cabinet members that I hope that you, and I'm sure you will, have the the same urgency, because these figures will be presented to you first. And I think we're going to go on to work programme in a minute, and I hope they'll be brought back to us in November, sharpish. But thank you ever so much, Seema. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Sheila and team. Councillor Rigby, of course.
Just a very quick question. Sorry, this is to Sharon, just regarding the public health breakdown, the 12 million. I think obesity was down at quite a low amount of 160,000, if I remember, but it was quite a low amount, quite towards the bottom of the table. But higher up the table, there was an amount for children, and I just wondered, obviously, with the strategy for the children's obesity, will anything, recommendations just come out of that obesity spend, or will some of it come out of the children's spend, which is a higher figure, higher up in the table?
So, it's a good question, and it's work that we're currently doing at the moment. So what you've got in the papers, the pie chart, is what we spent in 2003, 2004, based on the way the public health grant was used. For this year, for children's weight management, we've incorporated it into the new contract with North East London Foundation Trust for the delivery of what's called here the Brighter Futures 0 to 19 service. So that's our health visiting and school nursing services primarily. So children's weight management now forms part of that contract. So we won't be reporting on it separately in the way that we've done here. One of the big gaps, I think, that the work that the Scrutiny Task and Finish group has highlighted is the gap we've got around pregnant women. From the work that we did last week, was it, with our task group. So the piece of work that we need to do around how we use our public health grant wisely to tackle the problem we've got with obesity in Thurrock, all age. So this includes women before they become pregnant, so preconception, all the way through to adults, is work that we're currently doing. I'm hoping that we will have some decisions, some conclusions and some decisions around that, certainly by the end of December, so that when we're looking at how we profile the public health grant for next year, we know exactly what proportion we need to be spending on weight management for the whole population. So looking at children, but all the way through to adults as well. So that's a piece of work that we're doing at the moment. And obviously the Scrutiny Task and Finish group will have a really important role, I think, in influencing some of those investment decisions we need to be making.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, we'll move to the recommendations. There are actually 5 recommendations on this report, all of which are effectively to note the positions. So as we come in towards the end of the meeting, if members are happy, I will just recommend that we note 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, and I will comment on there that I expect there to be some discussion about the impact of the slippage of 11.776 million. I can't understand how that figure comes out. 11.776 million slippage in the capital programme, including the aforementioned A13, which I await with interest. We note that the position remains provisional, which is, well, it remains provisional until it's written. We note that Q2 report will present a movement between quarters. Well, in all my life of reading things, I find that quite amazing. It's either going to say one thing or the other. So let's look forward that hopefully it's the improvement that Seema mentioned to us. So do members agree to note all those points? Thank you very much. Which takes us to our final item of the evening, which is our work programme. And certainly looking at it on the 19th of November, we've got a couple of important things on there, not least is the estates review and proposals, and I'm sure that Councillor Hooper will be very interested in that one, because I know he's been taking a huge interest in particular. Well, he takes a huge interest in everything, but also hospital in particular. This strange item, the Mid and South Essex Foundation Trust Strategy Development Programme, working with health partners, which possibly relates to the Alliance as well. So I suspect those 2 items may end up being merged in some way, shape or form. Already on the agenda, we have asked, as I mentioned earlier, a very high-level representative of the Mid and South Essex Integrated Care Board to come and present to us. So we've got 3 substantive items on there. Members, do you have anything that you think we should have on in addition at this point in time, or are you happy to leave it in a state of flux? Sorry, there will be another item, but I'll leave that to Sheila.
Yeah, I think committee to have a look at the Ofsted ILACS report will have been published on the 29th of October. So this is the first date that it can come to people, committee.
My apologies, Sheila. I've actually written it down to say it and then just got distracted. So fingers crossed that we will have something that will make us smile on that. Any member got anything else that they think we should? Yes, Councillor Manwell.
It's just a point of clarification. When we're looking at the estates review and proposals, is that to do with the alternative potential locations for the integrated medical centres that weren't able to be delivered? Is that what that is, or? Yeah, I just want some clarification.
I think it's a broad.
My understanding is it's wider than that. So there is, so as I say, there has been, the Corringham has been delivered. I think there is I can't speak for the NHS yet as to what the position is vis-a-vis. I know the idea was that also hospitals, well, that future might be, was predicated upon the other three areas. I think that would be part of the conversation, but I think the agenda item is probably wider than that as well.
Okay, so it doesn't include that then?
Basically. I think it will. I would think it will.
Oh, it will
cover that
and more. Okay, yeah, I understand. Thank you.
If I might make a suggestion, and I think it's worked quite well, and it's an ongoing process. I think, given those at this point, it's a broad brushstroke for a series of agenda items on the 19th of November. If you have any particular concerns relating to estates review and proposals, whether it be ORSIP, whether it be the IMCs, or whether it be something in Tilbury that's particularly concerning you, what I would suggest is send a question, send it to Claire, we'll circulate it, and then we'll reshare. You know, this is a living committee. It will change, it will vary. And what's really important is that we get the issues that you want to know about on behalf of your residents. And I think what it will also do is will help shape the reports. And that's what happened earlier on with a couple of the reports. The answers to the questions were actually written into the report because it gave officers an insight into what we were looking for. So there has to be collaboration between, I mean, we're here to hold them and to account, but equally there's got to be an element of collaboration. I think it's working well. I think it will get better. So don't forget, it's our committee. We can shape it at any given time. But I think it's been a good meeting tonight. I thank everybody for their input, both before and during the meeting. I do thank officers, those that have disappeared. Please pass on thanks already. I appreciate it's another late night on the end of a long day, but we're all hopefully going to be moving in the right direction. So at 21:25, I will call the meeting closed. Thank you.